welcome Ashok Vajpeyi, the famous bureaucrat, impresario, poet, critic, and many more prefixes and suffixes can be added to your laurels. Ashok and me have a long relationship. He was the person who gave me my first job when I was struggling with nothingness. And for that I'll always be very, very grateful, because it was a very special and life-altering experience for me to be with you in Bharat Bhavan. Ashok, you've been a bureaucrat for most of your professional life. And a bureaucrat, by its very, the temperament of the word seems to suggest a Philistine. But you broke that myth completely. And what was interesting is, even though you were a bureaucrat and you were an institution builder, you're also a poet of great renown and recognition. How did you have all these qualities collapse into one person?
Well, a bureaucrat I became by chance. It was more the wish of my father, you know, the middle class pipe dream to get into the IAS.
Yes.
In fact, when I got into the IAS, I didn't want to get into the service. So I rang him up, and I was then a teacher. And my father said, have you ever been sitting in the staff room of your college? And I said, yes, every day. And he said, what kind of a conversation takes place there? And all that I could recall was promotions and pay scales and dearness allowance and such other trivialities.
Yeah.
So he said, oh, you don't have to be, I mean, if you're interested in the life of imagination and intellect and ideas, you will have it wherever you go. So it has nothing to do with your being an academic. Try it out. If you don't, you have a good record, then you go to Oxford, do your PhD, become a proper academic. And I entered the service, and then I found that there was enough scope in the service to save you from the rough and tumble of the bureaucratic structures and their procedures and approaches. And it occurred to me that it's possible to take your love of arts into the official domain. And that's what I did. In fact, you know, I had already written poems about Ali Akbar Khan and Hussein's painting. I had written about Shamsher Bahadur Singh. They were part of my poetic sort of concern. So my love of the arts had already started when I was a student, and I had trained myself to sort of appreciate the arts. And then I found that if you are not overly ambitious in terms of political gains or in terms of bureaucratic positions, and you choose your margin, that margin you can survive in.
Well, you know, it was very much in evidence, because Bharat Bhavan became a temple of the arts. And I think it was the first of its kind, and I don't think it's been replicated anywhere else since and before, where you managed to understand that the performing arts and music and literature did not exist in little silos, but somewhere collapsed into each other. So that whole approach was such a generous approach, an expansive approach towards the arts, which you envisaged as an idea and concretized it in Bharat Bhavan. And your capacity to be able to have got the best minds of that time to come and be there,
yes,
was really a triumph, which I don't think anyone has, I don't think it's happened after that. I mean, how did you manage? How did you manage to get a J. Swaminathan and a Nirmal Verma and a B.V. Karant to leave the directorship of the National School of Drama and come to what would be an unknown space?
Well, in the first place, all of them were known to me. They knew me as a poet. They knew me as a person with concern and passion for the arts. So that was one. Two, I assured them that their self-respect, their dignity, and their possibility of experimentation and innovation would in no way be compromised. And I ensured that. I luckily had a politician, Arjun Singh, who gave me full support. He did not interfere. He interfered in everything else, but not in culture. And that was the primary reason, because to persuade Swaminathan, we had to have the services of Krishan Khanna, Mallikarjun Mansoor, and half a bottle or perhaps a bottle of Old Monk, which clinched the issue one evening.
That's a very minimalist way of putting it.
And to persuade Karanji had been to Bhopal before. He had done theatre camps, and there was already an impact. A kind of a new theatre has started emerging in Bhopal and in Madhya Pradesh because of him. And then he was leaving. Karan could not stay anywhere for long if you're traveling. So he was a traveler, a yayavar as we say. So I thought this is a good opportunity to grab him, to bring him to Rangamandal. Just as you were accidentally there.
I was at the
and we got you, and you contributed a lot to the making of Rangamandal, to the new experiments that we are doing. And then the notion that all the arts can be brought under the same roof, in the vicinity of each other, in interaction and dialogue with each other, which has been part of the Indian tradition till the 19th century. And comes this strange kind of modernism which creates categories and hiatus between. So literature, theatre, visual arts go one way. They become contemporary, they become modern, and music and dance go another way, they become classical. Now this, I thought, was a false construct, and this has to be undone. So even before Bharat Bhavan, we used to do if you remember, a multi-arts festival called Utsav, in which all the arts will come together. So we'll have poetry reading, we'll have an exhibition of art, we'll have some intellectual discussions and performances of music, dance, contemporary theatre, etc. So Bharat Bhavan became a permanent festival where people came to see a play and would meander into the art gallery. People came to see the art gallery, would find a poetry reading going on, and would stay on to listen to that. So and I discovered that among the ordinary rasikas, it is possible to create a kind of a taste which can look at abstract art, listen to Dhrupad, see a performance of a modernist play, go and listen to Kumar Gandharv or Mallikarjun Mansoor, and watch Yamini Krishnamurti or Birju Maharaj perform.
But what was interesting in that whole energy that was happening in Bharat Bhavan was that there were leakages and spillages.
Yes.
Which was what was the fascinating aspect of it, where Swamiji designed the set for Midsummer's Night Dream, where writers and poets translated in Bundelkhandi and
Malvi and Chhattisgarh,
the what you call the bolis of Madhya Pradesh. So these spillages and leakages enhanced and expanded and took away that narrow boundaries in which you referred to as a post-19th century phenomena. That was a very interesting aspect.
I thought we tried institutionally to redefine the notion of contemporaneity, to say, for instance, what Swami did in Rupankar, to say that not only urban art is contemporary, but folk and tribal art.
Yes, I remember how he had folk artists next to contemporary artists.
And they're working together.
This is like Paul Klee.
So working together. And the same idea was carried in theatre, where for the first time, in fact, in the history of Hindi theatre, full-length plays, both from classical to modern, were performed in these bolis. I don't think ever Samuel Beckett would have been performed in Chhattisgarh.
Yes.
You couldn't have a Brecht being done in Bundelkhandi, Caucasian Chalk Circle.
Yes,
And we had Malavika Agnimitram being done in Bundelkhandi. We had the Mrichakatikam being done in Malvi.
Yes.
Now, the idea was that we should try to look in a post-colonial way at contemporary creativity, to make it more inclusive, to make it more real to our situation.
Well, I think in a certain way it was like culture in the making.
Yes.
Because, or culture in action. Because what was very affirming that it could work, a Brecht in Malvi or a Chhattisgarhi, a Samuel Beckett, has now percolated all over the country.
Yes.
Where these kind of, what is being taken as something that is acceptable was the first time the experiment really happened in Bharat Bhavan.
Yes.
But what I also found very fascinating, Ashok, and for this you must be given complete and full credit, that you didn't come up with a big institution like Bharat Bhavan, but you prepared the city to receive the notion of excellence. Because prior to that, you had done a lot of work which, when I came, you know, it had already become part of the folklore, where you had got the local actors working with Bansi, M.K. Raina, B.V. Karan, and preparing them, because to support an institution like Bharat Bhavan, you need to prepare a community that will support it.
Yes, of course. And I must say that Bharat Bhavan came up in 82, and I started work in 73.
Yes.
So it was already about 10 years in which Bhopal has seen some of the best that was happening in the performing arts and visual arts and literature. So they were, in a manner of speaking, has been initiated into. But what should not be forgotten, that there was a very aggressive mediocrity surrounding all this, which kept on attacking it.
Yes.
The local media, I mean, you know, I remember once Arjun Singh was away for 10 days, he had gone abroad, and he came back and he rang me up late in the evening, and he said, Vajpeyi Sahab, is nothing happening these days from the Department of Culture? So I said, no sir, we have done this, that and the other. He said, no, I was looking at these press clippings and there is no attack on you in the past 10 days. So what's the matter? so you know.
I'm quite aware of the fossil art that is coming.
So it was also this a hostile local press, media, and all the mediocres, whether in literature or in visual arts, you know, all gang up, and they would go to the government often and give memorandums and point out to this, that and the other. There was the other political difficulties with anti-Arjun Singh faction in Congress would sort of cook up something and come up with that. But what stayed back, the fact is that we bought, for instance, a Christie fellow went there, and this is about 10 years ago, and came back, and I ran into him in a party in Delhi, and he asked me how much did the collection of modern urban art that Bharat Bhavan had would have cost. And I remember the figure because the amounts were so small. I said about 34 lakhs. He said, what? 34 lakhs only? You can sell it for 40 crores today. And this it said 10 years ago. Now it will be 100 crores. So it is one of the fine. And the other thing that was important was we worked seemingly as in an arbitrary fashion. That is, we would not pass the buck to someone else. Decisions were taken at the spur of the moment and implemented. But what was important was that while we took those decisions, each decision was imbued with democratic spirit.
Yes.
Swami, as you remember, was opposed intellectually and as a painter to the new narrative art. He attacked it intellectually from every possible forum. But it is Swami who created the finest collection of new narrative art in Bharat Bhavan. Because he argued that as a curator of a public institution, I have to collect whatever is important.
That brings me to a very interesting interjection. There were no prejudices that existed. One saw that.
Yeah.
That even though one may have had a particular approach or vision of what art is, but many cross currents were given the space. And yet you called your magazine Purvagrah.
Yes, because the mystique behind this name was, it was a provocative name in the first place, and secondly, I thought that this concept that one is entirely without prejudice is an impossible concept.
Yeah.
In the sense, either God would have no prejudices, or perhaps somebody, a yogi or somebody like that. We, the lesser human beings, whether we are in art or not there, we will have our prejudices. The interesting thing is, what happens to your prejudices when you are faced with a work of art which demolishes your prejudices or goes beyond them. And therefore, at that point of time, to call it prejudice was that here, our prejudices are these.
Yeah.
And mind you, that Hindi journal in its 100 issues, which were edited by me, had special numbers on Kumar Gandhar, Habib Tanveer, on Mallikarjun Mansoor, Satyadev Dubey, on Raza, on Swaminathan, a whole lot of Ram Kumar, Hajai Prasad Dwivedi, Agge,
They become collector's items now.
Nirmal Verma, Raghuveer Sahai, etc. And mind you, all of them had their own vision. Karanth had a vision which was not exactly in tandem with the vision of Swami.
I think Karanth's vision changed from production to production.
Yes, but that whatever it was.
He was such a maverick in that
but
sense.
you see, the point was that here was a camaraderie in which we fought many times. And for instance, I said 6 productions. Nemiji said, why do you have 6 productions?
Yes, ask
There's
me.
too many.
I had to do costumes for those 6 productions in 3 weeks.
But finally, it was Karanth who decided to have 6 or whatever the number. We will fight with Swami and Nirmal, and everybody will fight. But ultimately, the decision was taken by the person who is in charge.
Yeah.
And it is possible to respect that. As a hindsight, I did it because I respected these people. They were friends, and I had no doubt about their integrity.
Also, it's a question of trust.
Yes.
Once you've deposited a certain kind of trust, then their decisions, whether they work or not, you have to allow.
Yeah. You know, I remember we did a Sarangi Mela. When the budget was being prepared, it was said that there are about 75 Sarangi players in the country. So I sanctioned a budget keeping in view that there will be 75 persons coming. The day the Sarangi Mela was to start, Om Prakash Chaurasia, who was in charge, rang me up in exasperation, saying that 126 persons have arrived. And I said, are they all Sarangi players? And he said, yes. So I said, then what's the problem? Treat them as our guests and carry on. He said, sir, but you had sanctioned a budget for 75. So I said, I now sanction a budget of 126. So it was possible.
Yeah, no, also, you know, one recognized when one was working in Bharat Bhavan that if you have an imaginative bureaucracy, then so much can happen.
Oh, yes.
You can alter things around.
Yeah.
And that is why it's so frustrating when you see roadblocks in terms of even very simple decisions that have to be taken.
Yeah.
I'm talking about having lived in Chandigarh for 25 years. Because my experience of having worked with you has spoilt me for life. And I know that nostalgia is a terrible thing because you've got to throw it out of the window at some stage. But I keep on remembering, you know, that you were one person who seemed to feel it's easier to say yes than to say no. And in that saying yes, many things fell by the wayside. But you preferred to do that rather than miss out on a possible potential event that would be of
You see,
meaning
when I came to Delhi against my will, because of the political administrative circumstances in which I was thrown in, I found this very strange. Then in the Department of Culture in the Government of India, everyone was very quick to say no to almost anything. And I turned the wheel again I started saying yes. Somebody comes to me, talks to me and says, this is what I want to do. I want to do a theatre festival. I want to do this or whatever it was. I am innovating this. There was a simple matter. The grants are given to institutions which are registered at societies under the Registration of Societies Act. That is what the rule says.
Yeah.
Veena Pani Chawla, who works somewhere in Pondicherry, raised an issue that she is being denied grant because hers is a trust. So I got the file and I wrote on it, why do we have the Registration of Societies Act referred to? Because we want that the institution must have a juridic personality so that if there is a misuse of the grant, the government can sue the institution. So there has to be a juridic personality to that. A trust is also a registered body. So it has a juridic personality. So there is no, it should be given. As long as I remain there for about, after this happened, for about 2 years, and things came back, bounced back, again the trusts are not being given. Now this is an absurdity. I think we have reached a point where you have to trust the people. In any case, if you give grants to 100 persons, 30–40% would not deliver. But if 60–70% are able to do something worthwhile, it's well spent.
And why be a Suj inspector, you know?
I mean, you can't do that. Secondly, the bureaucracy has to develop a respect and regard for the artistic community. It thinks that they are all, you know, out there to cheat you or to take money out of you.
They are kind of bohemians,
mavericks and things that kind, and people like that. And you then get non-professionals. If you look at the entire bureaucracy that heads and sometimes is deeply entrenched, public institutions of art are all being destroyed in this country by their own bureaucracy. You have non-professionals or professionals who have hardened into unimaginative, anti-innovation sort of.
This is a really major syndrome.
Yes.
And this is somewhere cracks in the Indian temperament. I've been teaching at the university since the last 23 years. And I can see how there was a time when there was an honor in terms of how you recruited professionals in a department. But now you see everyone is coming through different methods, which are not very laudable. And you can see how institutions are completely dissolving into mediocrity. So it's not only in bureaucracy, it's not only in institutions, but it's also in small little departments. And you don't really know that how, as a practitioner of the arts, how I can affirm my existence when all around one, you're surrounded by circumstances which seem to celebrate that which is ordinary, that which is non-creative, non-challenging. So you can see it whether it's at the National School of Drama or it's at the Lalit Kala. I mean, Diwan, of course, is an exception. You can see it in institutions all over. Now when I go to Bharat Bhavan for a performance, I'm so saddened. I'm so saddened because it's nice and clean, but there's an absence of life. A complete absence of life. And I think when I walk inside the gallery, I feel, oh my God, you know, there's not enough vigilance or alertness. And I do remember how it was a labor of love, where Manjeet Bao was on a ladder, hammering a nail, and you would rush off to get food for everyone. And I had my kid in a bassinet, trying, you know, we were making sense and trying to find a method in this chaos. But Ashok, to move on, because you have many more dimensions, I know Ashok, Bharat Bhavan was one of the most significant, visible aspects of your creativity, but you're also a very eminent poet, and you have written poets about love, about mother, about grandchildren, about pain, about loss. I mean, there's been such a range. You know, you've written over a dozen books. You've written many books on criticism. You head the Raza Foundation. So there's such a polyglot of things to dip into while talking to you. But as a poet, what informs your work? Is it life experience? Is it society? Is it politics? Is it the changing external scenario, or is it to do with your own inner private space?
Well, you know, poetry can't possibly choose a situation of either or. It can't choose the interior forgetting the exterior.
Yeah.
It cannot choose one area forgetting the other areas which impinge upon that area. So in that sense, my poetry is also, but I have tried to evolve a deeply personal voice. I have written as many as 14 books of poetry.
Yes. You also written about the Auschwitz.
Yes.
Yeah,
I have written about Auschwitz, but I have also written about the death of Kumar Gandhar.
Yes.
I have written poems about all kinds of people, about grandchildren, about my son and daughter, about my loves and about my passions and this, that and the other. In fact, I would like to think that if I were to sum up, I would say everything else that I did is really an extension of my poetry. Basically, whatever I have done, whether in Bharat Bhavan or in terms of criticism, and it is born out of maybe 3 or 4 thematic obsessions. One is a deep sense of love and gratitude to the world, which is a slightly rare emotion these days. Everybody wants to judge the world rather harshly and talks about tension. Not that I haven't, but I think there is enough in this world for an Indian
to hold on to
and to celebrate. Yeah. So I have a strong celebrative instinct. 2, I think there are 2 poles which no major effort at creativity can possibly avoid: the pole of love and the pole of mortality. And I try to address that.
It's a very Zen thought.
Yeah, yeah. And the third is that while it is possible to keep on getting, react to what is happening, and react to it as passionately and as intensely as you want to, there is a search for a home of silence. And that search for home of silence also brings a certain melancholy, a certain sense of failure, that ultimately there is no home, that ultimately it's impossible to reach that point of silence that you yearn for. And therefore, those who have read my poetry with some degree of understanding and depth have found that here is a poet who looks so celebrative but has sadness sitting at the core, and which is somewhat Rilkean, if you like, somewhat like
It's like Henry Miller says that when you write, you wear the robe of a priest.
Yes.
So there is that immense silence, and
yes,
that
and
that consciousness of your mortality,
and
brings in with it a sense of a passing.
Yeah,
The sense of a passing is a loss.
Yeah, and then I became, although unwittingly, and later I thought this was I became an adversary to a lot of contemporary poetry that is being written in Hindi today. There are these leftists and there's Marxists and all kinds of varieties of people. And I chose to look at the person, the personal, and that itself was unacceptable. Then for me, the arts have been a very important aspect of my life. That is the second life given to you. So I have a whole book of poems.
Atul says my second breath.
Yeah, and I have written about musicians, about painters, about dancers, about other, etc., etc. And lastly, I think, I wanted to be seen as a person who was grateful, who's full of passion and gratitude.
Oh, that's lovely.
And that gratitude was not merely to the world, but also to the ancestors, those who have made it. I recently published a book in which I have used lines of poems of Kabir as the title, and I play upon that image.
Would you like to?
I don't remember that, but anyway, sort of. So you see, and yet, in spite of everything, I have, my latest book is called Kahin Koi Darwaza. Now, the whole line is Kahin Koi Darwaza Khulta Hai. By just writing a poem, or by just doing anything creative or imaginative, some door somewhere opens. You may not even know where, and you may not even have the inkling of what door, but it happens. At least that's my poetic belief, and kind of you may say I may delude myself into that belief.
No, I think we all have to, we need our dreams and we need our delusions. Ashok, another thing I want to ask you, just came into my mind, while you were talking, which was so moving. It's actually a question I also ask myself. You also grew up in a very small provincial part of Madhya Pradesh.
Yes.
Provincialism has its own kind of restrictions, its own kind of closed doors. There are not many open doors. There's a prescribed pattern of expectations,
yes,
which you don't really recognize that there's a larger world. There's not that kind of access to books, to literature, to music, to a kind of internationalism. I would use that word with a little amount of hesitation. I also grew up in Amritsar. I came from a family which was decontextualized in terms of the arts.
Yeah.
How did you find that liberal space? How does one find that liberal space? What are the urges within one where one shakes off almost like the dust and the grime of conventions and dead habits and cliche-ridden stereotypical thinking to move into questioning, into a quest?
You see, in my case it happened when I started writing poetry very early, and I had some very fine teacher, a great teacher in fact, who at the age of 13, 14 gave me the ambition that because you belong to a family of administrators, you must get into the IAS but die as a poet. Now tell, what a audacious kind of a ambition to give to a young student. But what happened was that while I was in Sagar, it has a very good library in the university. And Rilke and Kafka and Camus and Pablo Neruda and Nazim Hikmat, all the books were there. So I started reading all that. And that's about the time when the struggle for the new, for the more modern in Hindi was being waged with great ferocity and intensity. And we became the first ones in Sagar. And we got huge support because I brought out a journal in which all the major writers of that time, Mukti Bodh, Agge, Raghuveer Sahai, Bhauri Prasad Mishra, Girja Kumar Mathur, etc. wrote. Because they found it very moving that some unknown people, young people in Sagar are bringing out a journal devoted to new writing. And then in 1960, when Udayan, my youngest brother, was to be born, I wrote a poem for my mother. And that became the first poem of my first book. And it was called Apni Asanna Prasava Maa Ke Liye Teen Geet, in which I praised the beauty of my mother. She looked to me beautiful. Now that created a huge huge controversy. That is son praising the beauty of his mother. This is sacrilege in what you have. Yes.
It's considered sacrilege.
Yeah, because you say, how can the son be talking, tumhari bahein ritiyon ki tarah yuva hain? To sort of say that your arms
entered into the description.
So but by that time I had sort of thought for myself that while I am here, I can still get access to a larger world. And therefore when I moved to St. Stephen's, this much larger world helped me. And I trained myself in the arts in 5 years in Delhi, attending every art exhibition, attending every music concert, going to recitals, watching plays and things of that kind. So that allowed me, in fact, I would say the arts allowed me the possibility of a liberal space in mind and heart. And that helped me very much in opening my poetry to other areas. And it also gave me the self-confidence, a sort of a stubbornness, if you like, to stick to your vision of life and reality. If it is in fashion, fine. If it is not, don't bother. And I learned that arts are a great help to make you cope with your essential loneliness, that they are your companions. And that's how it worked. And therefore, when I say that I want to be remembered as a person full of gratitude and passion, it was because of this, because I think in the darkest moments, and one comes, I mean, everybody's life is full of such moments, you had that you can go back to them. You can listen to Mallikarjun Mansoor and forget about what's happening outside.
Ashok, I'm going to ask you a very, very boring question. Doesn't behoove me to ask you and doesn't behoove you to answer it, because I don't believe in my own question, but nevertheless, I'm going to ask you, how do you define yourself as a poet, as an institution builder, as a bureaucrat, as a critic, a very eminent critic, well, as a commentator on modern visual arts?
Well, one of the answers would be, why can't I be all this?
Of course you can be.
But at a more serious level, I say whatever I do are really extensions of my being a poet.
And the core?
And the core is poetry. I mean, I like to be remembered as a poet who did many other things. There have been many other poets who have done similar things. Yes. There were big poets like T.S. Eliot, who was also an editor in Faber and Faber, and there were people like Saint-Jacques Peirce and Octavio Paz, who were ambassadors. Pablo Neruda was also a diplomat, etc. So there have been many people. But somehow, in the Indian situation, to be a poet and to be doing nothing else is not practical. So I did many things.
Being a lotus eater.
Yeah, lotus eater and things like that. So I did many things basically to justify my being the poet. So, but you know, the whole idea, and this is where the arts help you and poetry helps you, is that you can exist in many times simultaneously, and that you can exist at many levels simultaneously. That it is given to the humans and their creativity and their imagination to be able to become multiple persons, which is not given, let's say, to a squirrel or a bird, at least as we know them. So it's possible, and it's possible more easily.
Each feed each other.
Yes, and it is not as if when I am doing something by way of making it, like I now look after as a foundation, and every second, third day something occurs to me that why not we do this. For instance, it occurred to me that the art critics are not celebrated. It's only the artists who are celebrated. So we are starting a series, The Art Critic.
Wow.
And we're going to have the first two is going to be Geeta Kapoor and V.N. Goswami.
Fantastic.
So things of that kind. Now this
but they are both very celebrated.
Yeah, but that's another matter. But they have not been explored critically, you know, sort of that sort of a thing. So that's the kind of thing. So I would basically think a poet who did many other things.
Ashok, you once shared a wonderful idea with me, which I would really like to see one day, which you talked about University of Indigenous Knowledge.
Yes.
Has that progressed anywhere?
No, it hasn't, because it was being talked about and there was some response, but no. I think one of the major problems we're going to face. Our universities have ceased to become producers of knowledge.
Absolutely.
There's almost hardly any exception.
Absolutely. I don't know, but I know about my university.
And I think the crisis that we are going to face as a society and as a nation is going to be that you are wanting to be a knowledge society without producing knowledge. And one of the major impediments to this production is you have completely bypassed, ignored, suppressed indigenous knowledge.
Yeah.
Time has come when we should resurrect and rejuvenate this knowledge which exists, and it is in live form, except that it is not in within the campuses. Nobody knows that these things exist. A lot of this has to be done, but I don't see the current. You know, Lohia once used a phrase, duties of despair, that there are duties of despair. And one of the duties of despair, I think, is to dream, is to dream, to keep on thinking that the given is not the ultimate, that alternatives are possible. So I live performing that duty of despair.
Oh, that's beautiful. And I think it's a wonderful note to end this conversation on. Thank you very much, Ashok. It's been a real pleasure.